Imagine opening a dusty old photo album and finding a picture that looks completely ordinary. Three children standing outside a factory on a cloudy afternoon more than a century ago. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. Just another frozen moment in history. But then, scientists look closer. They zoom in, enhance the image, and suddenly the ordinary becomes extraordinary. What they uncover inside that single photograph doesn't just raise questions, it challenges everything we thought we knew about time, memory, and the limits of human life itself. Tonight, we'll take you on a journey back to 1911, inside a textile mill where children toiled away under conditions most adults today would never survive. Among those children were three girls. Their names have been nearly lost to history until now. Because hidden in their story is a mystery that has baffled historians, scientists, and skeptics alike for more than 100 years. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Do you believe history still hides secrets waiting to be uncovered? Or do you think every mystery has a simple explanation? Your opinion matters, and we'd love to hear it. In the early 1900s, America was a country of contrasts. On one hand, it was a land of opportunity, booming with new industries, railroads, and factories that promised steady work. On the other hand, it was also a place where children, some as young as 6 or 7, were forced into those very factories. For families living in poverty, the wages of a child often meant the difference between food on the table or going hungry. One of the places where this reality played out was a textile town in North Carolina. The mills there roared day and night, filled with the constant hum of spinning machines and the choking haze of cotton dust. Workers labored 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, breathing in fibers that clung to their lungs like invisible chains. For most, this was simply life. But for children, the cost was far higher. Their bodies were small enough to crawl between machines, their fingers nimble enough to untangle threads. But their young lungs and fragile bones were never meant for such punishment. It was in this harsh world that three young girls, Pearl, Viola, and Penelope, were asked to do something unusual. On a gray afternoon in 1911, a photographer arrived at the Port Mills factory. His name was Thomas Himmel, and his mission was not art, but evidence. Himmel was part of a growing reform movement determined to show the public what child labor really looked like. His photographs would later be used to push for labor laws. But on that day, the girls had no way of knowing the weight of the moment. He called them outside, away from the clattering machines, and posed them in front of the factory office. The air was still heavy with dust. The ground beneath their feet was hard-packed earth. They stood stiff, serious, their expressions already lined with the fatigue of lives spent working far beyond their years. Pearl Turner was only 9. Her eyes, dark and cautious, carried a weight no child should bear. Beside her stood Viola, her older sister, just 14, her face pale and drawn from years of exhaustion. The third girl, Penelope, was a neighbor, 12 years old, with no recorded family to speak of. Even in the photograph, she looks different, almost distant, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. The shutter clicked. In an instant, their likeness was frozen in time, just one of hundreds of photographs documenting child labor across the American South. To the photographer, it was another case, another example of injustice. He packed his equipment, thanked the girls, and left. To everyone else, it was just another image, destined to gather dust in an archive. But history, as it often does, had other plans. What no one could have imagined on that cloudy afternoon was that this ordinary photograph would resurface over a century later. And when scientists enhanced the image with modern technology, they discovered something that could not be explained by poverty, genetics, or even time itself. For now, though, let us stay in 1911. Imagine the three girls walking back inside the mill, returning to their machines. The older workers barely looked up. Children in factories were nothing unusual. Pearl's small hands reached for tangled thread. Viola coughed quietly. as she often did. And Penelope, the mystery girl, slipped back into her place among the spinning looms. What became of them after that day? History tells us that many children who worked in mills died young, their lives cut short by disease, injury, or exhaustion. But not Pearl. She would grow older, live longer than anyone expected, and leave behind descendants who carried traces of something extraordinary within them. Viola, sadly, would not be so lucky. And Penelope, well, Penelope's story is one that no historian, no scientist, and no skeptic has ever been able to fully explain. The photograph was meant to be a warning about the dangers of child labor. Instead, it became a doorway into a mystery that would span generations. A mystery about survival, about human limits, and about a girl who may not have been entirely like the rest of us. As we move forward, and remember this, sometimes the most powerful secrets of history are not written in books or carved into stone. Sometimes they hide in plain sight, in the faces of children staring out from a photograph, waiting for someone, decades later, to look closer. As the years passed, the photograph of Pearl, Viola, and Penelope sat quietly in an archive box, unseen and forgotten. Life moved forward, the world changed, and those children became nothing more than silent faces in a century-old picture. Or so it seemed. Fast forward to the present day. Professor Sonia Abernathy, a historian at a university in Georgia, was working with her assistant Marcus to digitize a massive collection of photographs from the early 1900s. Among them was the image taken outside the Port Mills factory. At first, it was just one picture among thousands. But Marcus, curious by nature, decided to dig a little deeper into the identities of the children. What he discovered was shocking. Viola, the older sister, had died just 4 years after the photo was taken. The official record listed tuberculosis, a disease that spread quickly in the damp, dust-filled air of textile mills. She was only 18. Several of the other Turner siblings had also died young, victims of accidents, illness, or the brutal conditions of mill life. By every expectation of the time, Pearl's fate should have been the same, and yet it wasn't. Pearl Turner lived until 1964. She survived into her 60s, a rare achievement for someone who had begun working in the mills at the age of 6. Not only did she survive, but according to census records and medical notes, she remained unusually healthy throughout her life. No chronic lung disease, no respiratory failure, none of the conditions that plagued so many others who had spent their youth inhaling cotton fibers. Professor Abernathy was fascinated. How could one child survive when almost everyone around her did not? Was it luck? Was it chance? Or was there something unique about Pearl herself? The idea might have stopped there, an interesting historical curiosity. But Marcus suggested something bold. With modern technology, why not digitally enhance the original photograph? After all, today's forensic imaging tools could reveal details invisible to the human eye. So, together, they began the process. They scanned the old photograph at the highest resolution possible. They cleaned the image digitally, sharpening the faces of the 3 girls. And then, slowly, they zoomed in on Pearl. What they found was enough to make them both lean back in silence. Her skin showed subtle markers, patterns and textures not usually visible in photographs of that era. The structure of her nose and the folds around her eyes appeared slightly different, almost as if her body had developed protective traits against her environment. It was something no one had ever noticed before. Intrigued, Abernathy and Marcus compared these features against medical journals and historical case studies. They could find no match. Eventually, they consulted geneticists, who offered a startling theory. Pearl may have carried a rare genetic mutation. One gene in particular, the MC1R variant, known today for influencing skin tone and sensitivity, has also been loosely associated with unusual resistance to certain toxins. Could Pearl's body have adapted to survive in the deadly air of the cotton mills? Could she have been, in a sense, the first documented case of a human being naturally resistant to industrial poisons? It sounded unbelievable, almost like science fiction. And yet, the evidence was there. Her survival against all odds, her unusual physical traits, and the complete contrast with her siblings' fates painted a picture that could not easily be dismissed. When Professor Abernathy presented these findings to a small gathering of scholars, the room grew silent. Historians frowned in disbelief, while geneticists leaned forward with interest. The suggestion was radical, that one young girl, forgotten by history, may have carried within her body a genetic shield against an environment that killed countless others. Pearl Turner was no longer just a face in a photograph. She had become a living question mark, a challenge to what we thought we knew about human biology. And if Pearl had indeed carried this rare genetic gift, the next question was obvious. Had she passed it on? Records revealed that Pearl had married a fellow mill worker named Darius Levston in 1921. Together, they had 3 children, but only one daughter survived into adulthood, Florence Levston, who later moved to Atlanta. Florence, in turn, had 2 sons. One of them, Kenneth, was still alive. At 61, Kenneth was a retired Air Force technician, living quietly in Georgia. When Professor Abernathy reached out to him, he agreed to meet. Sitting across from her in a small diner, he listened politely as she explained the photograph, the genetic theories, and her belief that his grandmother might have been unique. When she finally paused, Kenneth nodded slowly. "My Grandma Pearl," he said, stirring his coffee. "She was something else, worked hard, outlived everyone. Never sick, not once, far as I remember." His words confirmed what the records had suggested. Pearl Turner was no ordinary mill worker. Kenneth agreed to undergo genetic testing. Weeks later, the results returned. The findings were astonishing. A rare mutation, one previously seen only in isolated populations in Europe, linked to cellular regeneration and toxin resistance. And Kenneth carried it too. It was more than a story now. It was proof. The photograph from 1911 had preserved more than the faces of 3 children. It had captured a genetic mystery, one that still lived on over a century later. But while Pearl's survival was remarkable, she was not the only mystery in the picture. Because standing beside her that day was Penelope, the girl with no past, no family, and, as researchers would later discover, perhaps no ordinary place in the flow of time itself. And her story was far stranger than anyone could have imagined. When Professor Abernathy and her assistant Marcus finished studying Pearl's strange resilience, they might have stopped there. After all, they had uncovered something extraordinary, a genetic clue hidden inside a forgotten photograph. But their eyes kept returning to the 3rd girl in that same picture, Penelope. She stood between Pearl and Viola, her expression unreadable, her dark hair braided neatly, her gaze fixed just beyond the camera. At first, Sonia Abernathy assumed Penelope was simply another mill child, one of the thousands who labored in anonymity. But when she tried to track her down in census records, birth registries, and mill rosters, she found nothing. No family name, no record of parents, no trace of where she had come from or where she had gone. It was strange, but not impossible. Many children in mill towns slipped through the cracks of history. Some were orphans, some transients. Yet something about Penelope didn't sit right. Weeks later, as Marcus sorted through other photographs from the same collection, he paused. There, in an image taken at a textile mill in Charleston, South Carolina, just a few years earlier, was a familiar face. A group of young workers stood in front of a weaving machine, and in the corner, barely noticeable, was a girl who looked exactly like Penelope. Same height, same braid, same expression. Marcus called Sonia over. Together, they compared the photos side by side. The resemblance was uncanny, too perfect to ignore. They ran the images through forensic facial recognition software, a tool designed to track aging across decades. The result came back with a match percentage of 99.8%. According to the algorithm, the girl in Charleston and the girl at Port Mills were the same person. There was only one problem. The Charleston photo was taken in 1908. The Port Mills photograph was from 1911. Yet in both images, Penelope looked identical, still about 12 years old. The more they searched, the stranger it became. In photographs from Savannah in 1914, there she was again. In Memphis in 1917, once more she appeared, standing just out of focus, her hands folded in the same quiet posture. Each time she looked exactly the same. Never younger, never older, always 12. It was as if time itself had passed her by. Historians suggested it could be a mistake. Perhaps a string of doppelgangers, girls who simply resembled one another. But the evidence mounted. Every comparison, every measurement, every forensic test pointed to the same conclusion. This was not coincidence. One night, long after the university halls had emptied, Sonia sat staring at a row of photographs pinned to her office wall. In each one, Penelope's face stared back, unchanged, unmoving, unaged. "Either we're dealing with the most unlikely string of chance encounters," she whispered, "or something far stranger." Then Marcus uncovered something chilling. While digging through an old mill ledger from Port Mills, he found a handwritten note from a supervisor. It read, "Strange girl, no record, just showed up one Monday and started work. Same name as before, same age as before. Doesn't talk much, works hard, doesn't eat, doesn't leave, ain't right." The entry was dated 3 years before the 1911 photograph. This meant Penelope had already been at the mill once before, apparently unchanged, even then. As Sonia read the words aloud, a silence fell over the room. The ledger hinted at something beyond neglect, beyond poverty. Whoever Penelope was, she seemed to appear and disappear across time and place, always the same age, always just on the edges of history. Some of the other researchers who saw the evidence laughed it off, dismissing it as folklore. But others whispered about stranger possibilities. Was she a child who had stumbled across something unnatural? A victim of an experiment? A traveler caught between times? Or was she something else entirely? By 1922, the last confirmed sighting of Penelope appeared in a photograph from a logging camp in northern Georgia. And then, nothing. No obituary. No death certificate. No record at all. As if she had simply vanished, leaving only whispers behind. But history has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. Because just as Sonia prepared to publish her findings, a package arrived at her office. It had been locked away in a postal facility for more than a century, never delivered, preserved like a message frozen in time. The recipient's name, written in delicate ink, made her shiver. Professor Sonia Abernathy. The package was dated 1913. Inside were 3 items: a faded photograph of Penelope, sitting alone at what looked like a train station, a pressed lavender flower preserved in a way no botanist could explain, and a note, written in looping, careful handwriting. "You're looking in the right place. But the question isn't who I am, it's why I stayed." There was no signature, no explanation. Only the overwhelming sense that whoever or whatever Penelope was, she had meant for this discovery to happen exactly now. For Professor Abernathy and her team, the mystery was no longer just about genetics or history. It was about time itself. And they were only beginning to understand just how deep the rabbit hole went. 2 weeks after Professor Abernathy first shared her preliminary findings about Penelope, the phone rang in her office. On the other end was a postal historian in Richmond, Virginia. His voice was calm, almost hesitant. "Professor," he said, "we've uncovered something unusual in one of our old storage vaults. A chest of undelivered mail from the early 1900s, and inside there was a package. It's addressed to you." Sonia froze. "That's impossible," she whispered. The historian agreed. The package was dated 1913, more than a century earlier. The handwriting was delicate, written with a fountain pen in looping script. The recipient read clearly, "Professor Sonia Abernathy, no return address, no sender." The historian admitted he had opened the parcel only to confirm its contents. Inside were 3 items, preserved far too well for their age: a faded photograph of Penelope, a pressed lavender flower, and a sealed envelope. When the package arrived by secure courier days later, Sonia and Marcus gathered in their lab to examine it. The photograph showed Penelope sitting on a bench in front of what appeared to be a steam-era train station. She was alone, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm but unsettling in its familiarity. The flower was even stranger. A botanist who examined it confirmed it was lavender, genetically identical to a variety native to France. But the pollen signature didn't match anything grown in the United States during the early 1900s. More baffling still, the flower was intact, its petals still supple, preserved with a compound that modern science couldn't identify. It was as though time itself had refused to touch it. Then there was the envelope. Sonia opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink still bold against the yellowed fibers. The message read, "You're looking in the right place, but the question isn't who I am, it's why I stayed." No signature, no date, no fingerprints. Only a cryptic clue that raised more questions than it answered. Marcus turned the photograph over, and there, etched into the back, was a set of numbers. Coordinates. 32 said again, I don't know you. Charleston, South Carolina, the same location where one of the earlier mill photographs had been taken. Beneath the coordinates were 3 words written in capital letters, "The room beneath." That very week, Sonia and Marcus traveled to Charleston. With the help of local authorities, they gained access to the crumbling remains of an abandoned textile mill. Much of it had collapsed, but part of the foundation was still intact. They brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan beneath the ruins. The results made everyone in the room pause. Beneath what had once been the records office was a sealed chamber, hidden under layers of concrete and earth. The outline of a hatch was faint but unmistakable. It was heavy, rusted, and clearly designed not to be found. With great effort, workers pried it open. The air that drifted up was stale and heavy, untouched for decades. A narrow staircase led downward into darkness. At the bottom was a single stone chamber. The walls were bare, cold, and damp. In the center stood a chair, and upon it something wrapped in linen. When Sonia carefully unwrapped the object, she found a leather-bound journal, tied shut with red twine. On the cover, etched into the leather with deliberate strokes, were the words, "Property of P." Her hands trembled as she untied the twine and opened the book. The first entry was dated October 3rd, 1881. "Today I was 10 again. My hands are still small. The mirror does not lie. I do not age. I cannot age. And I have no one left to ask why." Sonia's breath caught in her throat. If this journal was genuine, it meant Penelope had already been trapped in her strange condition decades before the 1911 photograph. Entry after entry told of factory life, of wandering from town to town, of men in coats who asked for her blood, of escapes into the night. Some entries were mundane, describing cold winters or overseers who disliked questions. Others hinted at a darker pursuit, shadowy figures who seemed to follow her from one place to another. Then Sonia reached an entry dated June 21st, 1911, the exact day of the famous photograph. "The camera came today. Pearl stood to my left. I warned her not to look back, but she always did things her own way. I hope she forgets me. Most of them do, but the scientist will not. And if this book reaches her, tell her I stayed because someone had to. There are others. I was just the first." The handwriting was steady, deliberate. Not the words of a frightened child, but of someone who had seen far too much. Sonia closed the journal, her heart pounding. For the first time, the mystery of Penelope was no longer just speculation. Here was her voice, written in her own hand, describing an existence outside the natural flow of time. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Who were the men in coats? What did she mean by "the scientist will not forget"? And, perhaps most unsettling of all, if Penelope was not the only one, then where were the others? The faded photograph had led them to a package. The package had led them to a hidden chamber. And the chamber had revealed a journal that could rewrite history itself. But this was only the beginning, because buried in the pages of that book was a trail that would take Sonia out of the mills and into the deserts of New Mexico, where Penelope's story would take an even stranger turn. Back in her university lab, Professor Sonia Abernathy placed the leather-bound journal on a clean white cloth. The cover was cracked with age, the words "Property of P" carved deeply into its surface. Whoever had written inside clearly meant for it to endure. She untied the red twine, opened to the first page, and began to read. The handwriting was precise, almost elegant. The first entry, dated October 3rd, 1881, chilled her immediately. "Today I was 10 again. My hands are still small. The mirror does not lie. I do not age. I cannot age. And I have no one left to ask why." Line after line confirmed what the photographs had only suggested. Penelope, whoever she was, had been living this strange reality long before the famous mill photograph was ever taken. She did not age. She could not age. Some entries were simple observations. The mill is colder this year. The overseer watches too closely. I keep my head down. Others hinted at encounters that defied explanation. They came again, men in coats with quiet boots asking for my blood, and I gave them nothing. I left the coin under the rail spike. They will know I've been here. The woman in red called me by a name I had not heard in 60 years. I left before she could say more. The journal was not just a diary. It was a survival record, a map of someone who moved across time without ever moving forward in years. Then Sonia reached an entry that made her pulse quicken. It was dated June 21st, 1911, the exact day of the famous Port Mills photograph. The camera came today. Pearl stood to my left. I warned her not to look back, but she always did things her own way. I hope she forgets me, most of them do. But the scientist will not, and if this book reaches her, tell her, I stayed because someone had to. There are others. I was just the first. Others? Sonia leaned back in her chair, staring at the words. For the first time, Penelope's existence suggested she was not unique. If there were others like her, where were they? Had they been hidden, or hunted, or simply forgotten? The journal's final entries offered a clue. One, dated in late 1912, read, Charleston is nearly done and I've marked the wall. Next stop, Santa Fe. If the light finds me again, I'll speak. P. The mention of Santa Fe stood out. Why would a mill child from the southeast travel nearly 2,000 miles across the country at that time? What did she mean by the light? And why Santa Fe? Determined to find answers, Sonia and Marcus traced old train routes from Charleston to the southwest. After weeks of digging through housing registries and land leases, they found a name, Miss P. Langston. According to records, Miss Langston rented a one-room adobe house on the outskirts of Santa Fe in 1924. She stayed there for 2 years before disappearing. No forwarding address, no notice. To most historians, this might have been a dead end, but Sonia believed otherwise. If Miss P. Langston was indeed Penelope, then perhaps traces of her life still lingered in the memories of those who had lived nearby. She was right. An elderly man named Hector, then 98 years old, recalled stories his grandmother had told him. He remembered a girl who lived next door, a girl who didn't eat much, didn't talk much, and never seemed to grow older. My abuela said she was a spirit. Hector chuckled. Or maybe a warning. When Sonia asked if any photographs existed, Hector nodded. In an old family album was a black-and-white picture of neighborhood children gathered at a summer water station. And in the back row, almost hidden, stood a girl with braided hair, her hands folded, her eyes hauntingly familiar. Penelope. A forensic scan confirmed it, 100% matched to the girl from the Port Mills photograph. No age difference, no change, still 12 years old. The photograph alone would have been astonishing. But what Sonia and her team discovered next was even stranger. Following notes in the journal, they hiked into the desert hills outside Santa Fe. Local legend spoke of an outcrop marked with strange symbols. When they found it, concealed behind decades of brush and stone, it revealed the entrance to a hidden cavern. Inside, the walls were painted with constellations, circles, and ancient alchemical symbols. In the center was a carving that read, "For the ones who stay." At the back of the cave sat a small box. Inside was a bundle of braided hair, preserved carefully in wax, and a note written in an unfamiliar hand. She was not the first. She will not be the last. The watchers continue. The message was cryptic but clear. Whoever Penelope was, she was part of something larger, perhaps a lineage, perhaps a secret group, perhaps something even stranger. For Sonia, the realization was overwhelming. The story was no longer about a single girl in a photograph. It was about a hidden thread running through history, a thread connecting the forgotten children of the past to something timeless, something still lingering in the shadows of the present. And Penelope, it seemed, was only the beginning. If this story made you pause, if it stirred something inside you, a reminder that history still holds secrets just waiting to be uncovered, then don't let the mystery end here. Like this video so more people can see it. Subscribe to our channel if you want to hear more forgotten stories, mysteries, and truths that the history books never told. And most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Penelope was real? Was she a miracle of nature, a government secret, or something beyond our understanding? Your voice matters. Every theory, every idea brings us closer to remembering the people history tried to forget. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to be remembered.